Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony King. I'm on the When Words Collide committee. I assume that most of you have met Dorothy either through her work or here at the convention. So, Dorothy, the first question I'm going to ask you is, how do you like us so far?
Oh, well, it's really been great. I'm so impressed with the conference, with the organization, and with the people here, with the writers. It's interesting to see how many writers there are here. And I really enjoyed my session Friday morning when we were talking about how to get published, and just lots of enthusiasm. Really like Calgary. It's been ages since I've been here. So all around, it's really fantastic.
That's what we like to hear.
And I'll be talking about it when I get back to the big bad Berg.
Good. Now, for those of you who have not read Dorothy's books yet, the first book in the series is The Witch of Babylon, which begins with kind of an unusual character. Can you tell me about John Madison, where he came from, what the inspiration was for this sort of antiquities dealer who gets sucked into this great mystery?
Sure. Well, first of all, when I was originally thinking about what I was going to write, and of course you think very soon about your character, he actually just showed up. My agent told me that I should be writing a female character because sometimes editors don't like someone of the opposite gender writing the character. And I thought about it, but he just showed up in my mind, even his name, the way he looked, his personality, everything. And it was so funny, sometimes in writers' classes they ask you to go and write this exhaustive list down of all their traits and things to help you get a sense of the character. Well, I didn't need to because he was already there. He grew up, first of all, he was told that he was born in Turkey and that his parents had died in an earthquake that caused a tailings pond to break open, something that anybody from BC will be unfortunately familiar with. And his much older brother brought him back to America, his half-brother, to New York to live with him and to raise him along with their housekeeper, Evelyn. John grew up in the shadow of his older brother. His older brother, Samuel, was a very famous and talented archaeologist and Assyriologist, and worked predominantly in Iraq, went on a lot of field trips in Iraq. John always felt a little not quite as good as his older brother when he was growing up, and he tended to be a little bit of a hellraiser, a little bit of a playboy, not taking life too very seriously. Got kicked out of university, stuff like that. At the opening of the book, prior to the opening of the book, there's a terrible accident, and John was at the wheel, and he was picking his elder brother up from JFK, and his brother was killed. So John is suffering from a huge amount of guilt over this. And then he gets plunged into this situation that he was completely unprepared for because he learned that his elder brother, in an effort to save a very rare tablet that was in the museum, actually took it. And the tablet has now gone missing, and so the quest in the book is for John to try to get it back, and also to try to learn why it was so important. So that's just in a nutshell, I guess.
Now, this treasure is Mesopotamian, ancient Mesopotamian, and you're a retired
city planner.
City planner from Toronto. So, I mean, were you in Iraq, Iran, those kinds of areas to do this research? What's the attraction for you of the Mesopotamian treasures that feature so prominently in the book?
Well, no, I never have gone there, sadly. I would love to. In order to go there, you either have to be very, very well off so that you can hire top-notch security, or you don't go. Some people do go with tourist groups, but frankly, I think that's quite unsafe, so I wasn't able to go. My interest developed really accidentally, because what I like to do with my novels, with all of them, is to take a very famous story that everyone's familiar with and give it a new twist and kind of retell it. So when I was initially thinking about the book, I was thinking, well, what story can I use? And then I was thinking, well, why don't I go back to the beginning and start with Genesis? So I started familiarizing myself with the Genesis stories again. And I'm going to step aside, with your permission, Tony, for a sec, and just give you an example, and you'll see immediately why I became interested in Mesopotamia. One of the great and very early Mesopotamian myths, it concerns a young woman who was under threat and took her little infant son, and she patched together a reed boat and sealed it with pitch, and put the little infant baby in this boat and pushed it into the river, and it went all the way down the river, and he was found and raised by a wealthy family. Now, I think that story probably sounds pretty familiar, right? That's the story of Moses. It was written 2300 BC, and it is the origin story of King Sargon, who was the first Semitic leader of Mesopotamia. He came after the Sumerians, before the Assyrians. It's his origin story, and it was written almost 2,000 years before the Old Testament. So I just mentioned that so you can get an interesting idea of how closely linked some of the Genesis stories are with the Mesopotamian ones. So when I read things like that, I said, okay, well, I've got to look into Mesopotamia. I started doing research about it, and I just fell completely in love with the culture. I suppose I'm not very objective, but the Mesopotamian culture easily ranks in achievement with the Egyptians, but it's not talked about nearly as much. But it was the Sumerians who were the first Mesopotamians, the first ones to build those great city-states, who gave us so many innovations. They're the ones that developed writing. They developed the calendar, the potter's wheel, a measurement that we still use today, the 60-10 measurement, that's theirs, astrology. It's absolutely mind-blowing how gifted they were, and I just completely love everything about their culture. And so while I was learning all that and reading about the historical sacking and looting and burning of the cities, their great cities, when they were at war with the Persians or with each other sometimes, the Iraq War broke out. And there on CNN in live color, I saw the sacking and looting and burning of the Iraq Museum. So that's how the first book got started.
And now you're a member of, should have written it down, but it's the Mesopotamian Society?
Yeah, it's out of the University of Toronto, started by some professors, the Canadian Society of Mesopotamian Studies, and they set it up just to try to help to spread the word about Mesopotamia. There was also a fabulous exhibit at the Royal Ontario Museum of, focusing on all their artifacts and their history.
How do you go from being an urban planner to an expert on Mesopotamia?
Well, I'm not an expert. I have to definitely underscore that. I'm just somebody who's read a lot. And it's funny because it's actually, being a city planner was actually the detour, because I studied English in university. I graduated as an English specialty in English. And I kind of fell into my city hall job, worked my way up to planner level, and finally took my exams. But I'm really going back to what I was educated for, being a writer as opposed to... But I agree, it's a pretty wild leap.
You also have strong support for groups like Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I understand that journalists were really instrumental in being able to provide you with some of the research that you needed to do these books.
Absolutely. It's something I think the whole notion of freedom of the press and protection for journalists has become such a huge issue. I am immensely grateful to journalists because I could not have written those books without them. They were really my eyes and ears on the ground, because I relied so... In order to, when you write a book, as I know Jackie Gass said the other night, you should really go there, but if you can't go there, you've got to rely on first-hand observations. And I got most of those through the journalist blogs and newspaper articles. And there's a little bit more to it than that, because the whole Iraq War I found emotionally really very gripping. I watched many, many hours of television footage. And there are certain iconic moments that really got to me. One of them was the shooting of a famous Middle Eastern journalist named Mazen Dana. That occurred in August 2003. And it was just a heart-rending situation. He had gone with the permission of the U.S. Army to film outside of Abu Ghraib prison. He'd gone in there with a French crew. They had permission. Everything was fine. The crew was finishing up, went back to the car. He got out for a couple of last shots, and a tank positioned in broad daylight 100 yards away shot him and killed him. And there are 184 journalists have died in Iraq alone. That doesn't include Syria and all the other spots. And, as I say, we should all be grateful to them, because they're risking their lives to let us know the truth of what's happening.
Were you able to develop any close relationships with any of the journalists?
Yes, as a matter of fact. One of the wonderful things about writing, especially, I should just mention that my books, the first book, is about there are three great Mesopotamian cultures: the Sumerians, who were first, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. So the first book is about the Assyrians. And one of the really neat things about writing this book is that I have made some friends in the Assyrian community. And it's just quite remarkable. I mean, the Assyrians have existed as an identity, a cultural group, for 4,000 years. Anyway, I was speaking with an Assyrian professor, and he put me on to an Assyrian journalist. He's actually Swedish. He lives in Sweden. And he and I became very, very fast friends. His name is Nuri Kino. Wonderful, incredible man. right now, Nuri is leading desperately leading, I should say, the campaign to try to save the Assyrians because they're being persecuted, threatened, and driven out of their homes in northern Iraq by what's going on there right now by the fundamentalist group. And it's just and also they've been caught in the Syrian one. So Nuri has been working tirelessly trying to help the refugees and do whatever he can.
In quite upfront on your books, there's a comparison asking if DJ McIntosh is the next Dan Brown. So I'm kind of interested how you feel about that, because Dan Brown has gone from being quite a celebrated author to an author who's not so revered as he was, let's say, when the Da Vinci Code first came out. So how do you feel when you see a comparison like that, especially on your first book?
Well, I have a lot of time for Dan Brown. Sometimes it seems that when authors or actors, whoever, when they really go huge, that there's an awful lot of criticism coming their way. I know this is a strange connection, but I've just discovered a new singer named Lana Del Rey, who I think is phenomenal. She's another one. She's like skyrocketed. And boy, oh boy, the criticism that's rained down on her shoulders. And so I think a lot of people do that for him. Yes, he is not, he's not Shakespeare, for sure. Sometimes his writing is a little shallow. But I have to admire his achievement. And I think his history and research is really very interesting. I wasn't wild about his second book. But I certainly wouldn't mind having his sales, I'll say that much.
And who wouldn't, really? Does it put pressure on you when you see that comparison to Dan Brown? Do you feel any sense of, I really have to knock the next one out of the park to live up to
a little
this
bit,
kind of
yeah.
hype? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How did you cope with that?
I drink.
Okay, another writer cliche. You mentioned music. You like guitar. I do too. Who's your favorite?
Oh boy. Now that is really, that is probably impossible. Well, I love rock guitar, electric, and particularly instrumental. And I love it to the point where I actually sort of blend it into my books. I mean, I mention, oddly enough, John Madison, the protagonist, really loves that music too. It's amazing that there's that coincidence. So I mention him a lot in the music in my books quite a bit. One artist who's incredible, and he's fairly way out. He's not pop. Is a guy named Steve Vai. Do you know Steve Vai?
Stevie Vai used to play for Frank Zappa.
Yeah. Oh, he's astounding. I mean, it's just breathtaking what he's able to do with the guitar. It really is. And some of his music is really inspirational. With The Witch of Babylon, when I was writing the ending, I had his song, Whisper a Prayer, in my head all the time I was writing it, and I would visualize the ending of the book with his, like a movie, with the music behind it. But other artists I really, really love. Sorry, just a sec. Well, anyway, first of all, if you're going to be a rock guitarist, you really should be named Steve. It's like, because I love Steve Lukather
Yes.
And his rendition of My Guitar Gently Weeps, you can see that on YouTube, is phenomenal. I love Stevie Ray Vaughan. And Jeff Beck, I saw him recently. Oh, that was really something. He looked like he hadn't aged 1 minute. Jimi Hendrix. And I know I'm blanking out here, and it's so crazy, but just a sec. I'm just blanking out. Of course, I know him quite well. Jimmy Page.
Oh.
Jimmy Page's solo in Stairway to Heaven on that double neck Gibson is probably one of the greatest guitar solos ever played. So that gives you a little bit of an idea.
You have a history as an activist. Mm-hmm. A bit of a radical, maybe?
Yeah.
Where did that? How did that happen? What were you involved in?
Well, it started when I was at university. Actually, I got involved with issues around freedom of expression at the university, and hung around with people at the Varsity, which was a student newspaper, and that kind of thing. And one thing led to another, and then I became quite involved just before and just after I graduated. I worked for the Ontario Union of Students, and we actually held a strike, in fact, at the Ontario College of Art to help save the jobs of a couple of faculty. Also, I lived in communes, and we had lots of notable guests. We had guests from the Students for a Democratic Society in the U.S. who were actually fleeing, and Danny Cohn-Bendit, Danny the Red from Europe, and I was quite involved in all that. So it probably isn't a massive surprise when people read my books. See what sort of direction they take.
But you weren't a ban the bomb kind of protester with the signs and that sort of,
I've
thing out
been
in the
known
streets?
to go to a few marches.
How did, as a former student activist, how do you react when you see something like the Occupy protests a few years ago?
Well, more power to them, but frankly, I didn't think it was very effective. I must say that, way back when I was involved in all that stuff, we could never have anticipated what's happening now. It's so far beyond, it's almost laughable except for being against the Vietnam War, but otherwise it's almost laughable. Now, the issues are absolutely massive, both economic issues, justice issues. So I frankly thought it was unfortunate, because an awful lot more, and there's a whole environmental stuff, an awful lot more is needed than just sort of some demonstrations. It was good to sort of get people together and things, but frankly, I don't think it had much of an effect on anything.
Are you active in any of the issues in the writing industry now? Has that previous activism?
No, it hasn't, and not because I wouldn't like to be. Hopefully I will be able to be more of a participant. With the journalists, I try to do a little bit of financial support and Facebook support, things like that. I'd like to be more involved with that, but I just don't have time.
What are the big issues that you see facing writers here in the early part of the 21st century?
Well, on that front, the freedom to write what you wish to write, even in North America, is very much endangered if what you're writing, it doesn't agree with the status quo. But especially in the U.S., there are all kinds of people who have been fired, whether they're university teachers or journalists, because they're not towing the line. I mean, we just saw quite recently that journalists were being pulled out of places because they were a little too direct. So there are those issues. As far as issues facing writers are concerned, well, the whole industry is in a real uproar right now because it's trying to transition from the massive move into digital and all the ramifications of that. And writers are kind of caught in this, and it's not clear, what's the best thing to do. That's just working out. As a matter of fact, last night I read a blog. Somebody posted it on Facebook. It was by a Christian author, and she'd had about 20 books to her credit, and I guess she'd done quite well. She made a living at it. And it was really quite touching because she said she's decided she can't write anymore because her books are just not doing well enough now, given the vast... So the number of books have increased exponentially. The choice for readers on the market has increased exponentially. So she's... I think her publisher actually dropped her, and she said she's probably going to have to look for something else to do. And that's a story that's been repeated quite a bit, I'm sorry to say. But on the other hand, I mean, it gives giving a lot of new writers very good chances, so it's not necessarily entirely negative.
When you're not writing, when you're in some new city, what do you do?
Oh, well, what I usually do is walk. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do that in Calgary, but because I've been very busy here. But I just like to walk and walk and walk and walk. I like to sort of visit the special sites, but that's less of a priority than just getting a feel of the place. I go to New York relatively often. Fortunately, I go there partly to do my research. I absolutely love New York, and that's what I do in New York. I just walk. I walk everywhere. Been up to Harlem a number of times, and I just love that because you get a real feel for what a city is like, what the people are like. When I go somewhere, I like to go for a long time. I have got a cute story about the other place I went, because my second book, the Book of Stolen Tales, is it's the search for a rare anthology of fairy tales. The first anthology of fairy tales was written not by the Grimms, but by a famous courtier and poet from Naples in the 16th century. So it's about Madison is hunting for a rare copy of this book that was stolen from him after he won it at an auction. Anyway, point of saying that is I went to Naples, and it was really, really funny because I don't speak Italian, and I thought, well, Naples is a big tourist city, so I'm sure that, most of the service people and stuff speak English. Nope. They didn't speak English. So that was interesting, but that's what I did in Naples. I walked tons and tons. Fabulous place, highly recommend. It's interesting, it's very poor, so a lot of the buildings are unkempt. But I just have, if it's okay, a little funny story about the language thing. I went to their great, fabulous library that's in the Royal Palace, and it's really stunning. And I tried to explain that I was looking for a copy of this fairy tale anthology because they have a copy of it, an original. And finally, I think I got through. The woman understood what I was asking for. And so she took me to another woman and explained something, and that lady took me to somebody else. I thought, well, okay, here's the Italian bureaucracy in action, Finally, an official-looking man came up, and I went through it all again, what I was looking for. Now, when I was when I told my friends I was going to Naples, they immediately said, "Oh, you're going to be mugged." My friend was mugged twice. Dangerous, awful, blah, blah, blah. So that scared me quite a bit. So I put my ID and my Visa card and stuff in my sock underneath, and then put my shoe on, right? So that it would be safe and sound. Well, anyway, this gentleman, and I should have, anticipated, of course, that they'd want that. This gentleman said, "Well, I'm sorry, you're going to need to see some ID." And I thought, oh no, I can take my shoe off right here. It's going to look so stupid. But what I'd done is I'd carried a purse with me, and I'd put a few lira and some dummy old cards and stuff in this purse. In case I did get mugged, they could have that, wouldn't matter. So I look through this purse, and I see my Ontario fishing license of 3 years ago. So I gave that to him, and he looked at it and he said, "Okay, that's fine." Anyway, it's really fun. I mean, it's kind of, in a way, it's hard to go to a place like that when you're completely on your own and you don't speak the language. There's definitely downsides to it. On the other hand, you have some really interesting adventures, and it forces you to talk to people and try to, find your way.
You mentioned that you like to go to the special places that are in these various cities. I assume you're talking about museums, historical places, but you also like shoe stores and jewelry stores, yes?
Yeah. I never return from New York without at least one pair of shoes and a bracelet.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to join in this conversation. Does anybody have any questions for Dorothy? Val?
I do. On your first book, you kind of left with a cliffhanger, and so we knew something was going to happen in the second book. On the second book, he's just going back to resume his normal life. So could you give us a little taste of what's going to happen?
I sure can. I'm just finishing the first draft of it right now. The first book, as I said earlier, will focus on the Sumerians. The Sumerians it's really an incredible story. It's one of the world's greatest historical mysteries because no one knows where they came from. Their language has no known affiliates in the world. So I solved that mystery in the third book. No, I'm partially kidding. I didn't. A couple of books I've read make some very persuasive arguments, so I'll be using those. In the third book, John is hired by a very famous and somewhat forbidding magician and spiritualist in New York to find his assistant, who was a very gifted magician, who disappeared 35 years ago along with a very rare book that the magician owned. So he wants John to find this man. This man apparently went first to Turkey and then to northwest Iran, seeking a place of power because he wanted to find the gift of eternal life. I know this sounds airy-fairy, but one thing I try to do with my books is show that there are actual how these kind of stories and concepts got started. So John, therefore, starts to follow in his footsteps. Along the way, one of the themes in the book all along has been that John increasingly does not believe the story he's been given about his birth, and realizes by the second book that there's something else going on there, and it's very important to him to try to find out where he was born and who his parents are. So at the conclusion of the third book, that will be revealed. And I think it'll be quite surprising.
I was just wondering if you could describe your path to publication, like how your first book came to be published.
Sure. I was really fortunate. As Tony mentioned, I was a city planner, and I'd spent 20 years writing bureaucratic reports. And that is not exactly a very good grounding for writing fiction, to put it mildly. So I spent some time, I started writing short stories, and I joined organizations like Sisters in Crime, Crime Writers of Canada, things like that. I networked a lot, helped out. I just got to know writers, started trying to educate myself, went to conferences. And one of the things I heard throughout talking to people was about the slush pile. You send your manuscript in to an agent or an editor or whatever, and they never even look at it, right? So it was really discouraging. And then I heard about a competition called the Debut Dagger that's run by the Crime Writers Association in the UK. It's a very highly regarded literary competition. Gets hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of submissions. And what you do with that is you submit the first 3,000 words of your novel along with a synopsis. And if you're lucky, you might get shortlisted or even win. So I decided, instead of sending my manuscript out, that's what I was going to do, and that's what I did. I really worked really hard on it. I revised it at least 50 times. I read everything that it won. Anyway, so I sent it off, not very hopefully. And lo and behold, didn't I get an email telling me I had been shortlisted? And that's still one of the biggest eureka moments in my writing career. I just couldn't believe it. It was just amazing. And why that competition is so good is because they distribute your 3,000 words and synopsis to top agents and editors in the industry. So I got a couple of agents knocking on my door, and I went with one of them. And that was a very good agent who had tons of contacts. So unfortunately, I had to leave her because her husband was not well, so she couldn't continue to represent me. But she put me onto another one who did a great job of getting me all the international sales and the Penguin sale, and that was it. It was sort of don't look back from there.
The Debut Dagger that year the competition was stiff, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, Alan Bradley won. Alan Bradley's story is even more amazing because Alan had literally only written 30 pages of his manuscript, and he won it, and he sold it to Random House for, I think, probably a very substantial advance worldwide based on 30 pages.
That's the sweetness at the bottom of the pie?
Yeah.
Yes.
And that, in fiction, that virtually never happens. I mean, Alan was unknown at that point. It's not as though he had a big name or anything. And Alan was from Saskatchewan or Alberta?
Canadian, I know, yeah.
Saskatchewan, yeah. Yeah. That was the same year. And Louise Penny had just been the year or two before that. Louise won the highly commended category. And again, that's what kickstarted her career. So we Canadian mystery and crime writers have an awful lot to thank the Debut Dagger for, that's for sure.
Any other questions? No? Anything that you would like to talk about in particular? Anything we haven't covered?
Gee. Thank you.
Eric? Yeah.
I mean, this is a bit of a cliche question, but I'm still interested in your answer. Just your advice on how to grow as a writer, or tips for getting better.
Getting better in your writing? Well, one thing I did and still do is I read books that I think are really incredibly well written, and a number of those actually can be literary, so they're not all literary. But I learn a lot from other writers. And what's hard about that is, like, Cormac McCarthy is a favorite writer of mine. I love his work. His writing, his actual writing style is just brilliant and it's so lyrical. When somebody's that good, it's hard because you're carried away with the writing, and you have to keep stopping yourself and saying, okay, exactly how did they do that? How are they doing dialogue so that it sounds natural, for example? So that's one thing. I think I found on Facebook a lot of writers are my Facebook friends, and a lot of them post articles about writing. And I found a lot of those articles really helpful. People blog all the time about writing, about various aspects of it. And I found that that's really, really useful, that, to just skim and read through some of those. So those are two practical things you could do. The other thing, and by the way, I'd suggest, I was a member of a critique group, and they were great in terms of giving me advice about my writing. But if you can get a real professional to read your work, their advice is just so good. And, if you happen to know somebody, for example, who's a copy editor, my books, Penguin always sends them to a really good first-class copy editor, and a copy editor does a lot more than just catch grammatical mistakes. I would strongly suggest that as well.
You weren't exactly an overnight success, were you? I mean, how long did it take you before you came up with the blockbuster first book?
No, it was long. I mean, I guess I started writing seriously at least 8 to 10 years before the book was published, yeah.
Anyone else have questions? We're almost out of time here. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, yes. Dorothy,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming.